Now, more of Illinois Rising, presented by the Illinois Policy Institute, the only show directly addressing the problems and solutions for Illinois. Now, from AM 560, here's Dan Proft.
Dan Proft back on this special edition of Illinois Rising with longtime Madigan spokesman Steve Brown. I want to pick up our discussion about the big systems in state government and talk more specifically about pensions. Public sector pensions, we've mentioned it, but perhaps it is the most salient financial issue facing the state of Illinois in terms of the impending collapse of pension funds, potentially, depending on whose actuary you believe. 5, 7, 10 years for teachers, CPS at least, Chicago Public Schools, 50% funded. Chicago Police and Fire, less than 30% funded. At the state level, of course, we talk about having the highest unfunded pension liability of any state in the nation, in the north of $110 billion. And there's, I think, a growing belief that there is no way that a state in the financial condition of Illinois is ever going to be able to live up to the promises it made to retirees as well as future retirees. Do you agree with that, or do you think we're somehow going to figure out how to pay down these obligations and bend the cost curve so that a teacher who's 40 years old today or a state employee who's 40 years old today can realistically believe they're going to get what was promised to them when they retire in 15 or 20 years?
Well, I think that's going to be a challenge, but I think that will be something that can be accomplished. Two things have to happen. One, you've got to put a payment schedule in place that actually pays what we said we were going to give these workers. The courts seem very clear that any real manipulation of the system, of the rules, of the laws that takes something away isn't going to be found constitutional. So I think you have to confront pain. I think you make whatever retirement plan is in effect for future workers, minimize that to the best of your ability, but understand with collective bargaining, that's going to be a challenge.
Well, so when you say put together a payment schedule that can meet those obligations,
right.
There's a story out just this week in Governing Magazine that there's no major public sector pension fund returning more than 1.5% this year.
Right, and they were all these projections were based on 7, 8, some numbers like that.
Right,
and they haven't been doing that for a couple of years.
Right,
that adds to the challenge.
There's no question. And so, where does the money come from exactly in a state that where residents already pay the highest property taxes in the nation, and according to the Tax Foundation, have the 5th overall highest tax burden in the nation? Well,
you have to look at options like a progressive type of income tax. Perhaps service taxes have been discussed. I'm not sure there's been ever a real concentrated effort to go in that area, but it's going to require revenue. I don't think a manipulation of the system that the Supreme Court in this state is ever going to accept.
And what about the public sector union's posture at this point, specifically AFSCME, because the largest state workers union, AFSCME, representing about 37,000 state workers, has suggested that they're prepared to strike if they can't reach a deal with Governor Rauner, and where Governor Rauner has negotiated 18 collective bargaining agreements with smaller public sector units, unions representing a smaller group of public sector workers, which include a wage freeze. Every single one of them had a wage freeze. AFSCME is demanding, at least at last time I checked, a 29% salary increase over the 4-year life of the contract. Depending on, again, whose numbers you want to believe, we're talking about a $1.5 to $3 billion contract AFSCME has proposed that the state can't finance. The state has almost $10 billion in unpaid bills, so just kind of more promises we can't finance, as we were talking about. So what about AFSCME's posture? Is that unreasonable if they would strike? Is it unreasonable if they wouldn't do what the other unions have done and take up wage freeze?
Yeah, I don't anticipate a strike. I think that it's probably a posturing rhetoric in terms of the collective bargaining process. I think from what I hear in those contract talks, if the union believed that the governor was going to have some serious negotiation rather than kind of use them as the piñata for a lot of his different ideas, they might have different terms. But so far, that's not been the case.
Okay, but has AFSCME and SEIU and the teachers unions, have they earned their piñata status? In other words, State government at present, I would argue, is largely set up to finance the salaries and benefits of these state employees and demands, like I just suggested. Now I give credit to the unions that said, we'll take a wage freeze. We have some understanding of where the state's at.
Most of them are better compensated than the rank and file AFSCME employees,
well, okay,
just for the record.
But most rank and file AFSCME employees are much better compensated than their private sector counterparts in the similar job classifications. Yeah. So, and by the way, those private sector counterparts don't have anything approaching the health insurance and pension benefits that state workers have. So again, is AFSCME being unreasonable by saying 29% over 4 years? If you try to do what you did with these other unions, then we're going to strike.
Again, I think that is largely rhetoric of a collective bargaining process. And if there was a serious contract negotiation entered into by the administration, I think you'd see more reasonable proposals.
Should they take a wage freeze?
That's in the eye of the beholder. The legislature doesn't get involved in negotiating those salaries.
Well, you tried to.
We tried to have some oversight, because usually what happens is whoever is the governor negotiates a contract. This sends the legislature the bill. And so part of the reason why we got to where we are today in terms of the payroll, the size of the workforce, how many people do what kind of jobs, is because the legislature wasn't involved in really much of that at all. So should they take you would think a wage freeze would be a reasonable idea, and I would assume that could be matched up with some other benefit issues that might make the unions a little more comfortable. But right now there is a pretty heated relationship going on there, and I think you understand it. And I think that's part of the Rauner approach to prosperity. Let's pound public employees.
Well, I think there's a difference between saying, I worked in the public sector. I worked in state government. I worked in local government. I have no antipathy towards people who work in state agencies or corrections or anywhere else in the public sector. They're a mixed bag, just like the private sector. The problem is you can't make these numbers work. And that's what we're talking about. You cannot make these numbers work. You have, just going back to the pensions in terms of pay in, pay out, when people who are not in the public sector hear these numbers, they're aghast. It's just not enough have heard them. I mean, the idea, for example, that a CPS teacher, and I have nothing against teachers, but a CPS teacher who pays $140,000 into the pension system can expect a $2.1 million return. In the private sector, you would have to save more than 10 times that to expect that kind of aggregate return. Right. And so it's just something that if number one, it's unfair because you have people making $50,000 financing guaranteed benefit levels of a multiple of that. Number two, you can't make the math work. 30 years of Mike Madigan has proven he may be fastidious and he may be focused, but he's not focused on arithmetic.
He's also not focused on COLA, early retirement, the pension investments, the fine work that the various pension systems have done with their fine managers and their, what do we call them, venture capitalists that have been taking the money. So yes.
Well, he signed on to Rod Blagojevich's $10 billion pension gambit.
That was a bond thing. And that actually, I think, made some sense in terms of the finances of that. If you talk to people, and I was a journalism major, Dan, so I don't claim to have a keen ability to explain every financial transaction.
That's more than most members of the Chicago and Springfield press corps are willing to admit, so I appreciate that.
No, I grew up in St. Louis, so that might make me a little bit different.
A little more humility, yes.
You are going to have to pay for these things, and they're going to require, I think you're going to have to look at different ways of finding revenue. And I talked about them earlier, I'll mention them again, the progressive tax and service tax, for example, and then try to show some restraint in the areas of spending. It's a challenge.
What about structural reform of these systems that we're talking about? For example, K through 12 education. And the spending in K through 12 education has gone up at a 45-degree angle for the last 2 decades. And are we getting 45% better in terms of the results, the education of students, the preparedness for college and the workforce?
Yeah, depending on which round of testing, which we keep thinking testing is the whole way to do all this. We're changing that yet another time.
Well, I don't think testing is the whole way to do it, but when 2/3 of children, of 2.1 million children in K through 12 are not reading or doing math in 4th grade or 8th grade at grade level, that's a big problem.
Yes, it is.
And so we're not getting bang for our buck, where these systems become third-party administrators to confer salaries and benefits to the adults in the system, regardless of performance. So what about completely rethinking how we do K through 12 education in the 21st century? For example, including introducing more competition into the system, like we have at the collegiate level, where you take your Pell Grant, your Stafford loan, your GI Bill dollars, and you schools compete for you, rather than this kind of funding centralized bureaucracies that have proven incapable of educating children.
So you're talking about either vouchers or a broader, a more expansive charter system, for example?
Opportunity scholarships. I mean, really, yes, letting public and private compete for students the way that we have at the university system. Why does it work there and there's no way it could work at the K through 12 level?
I don't know that it can. I'm not sure we've seen examples of it necessarily. I'm not familiar with.
We have 14 states that run 24 different school choice programs. Milwaukee's had one for 20 years.
Okay. But how do you?
Is that something that Mike Madigan and House Democrats, I mean, particularly those that represent minority communities in Chicago that have seen generation after generation of children not even close to afforded the opportunity to earn a quality education? It's criminal what CPS has done. Or more to the point, has not done in terms of providing educational opportunity. And why is there no sense of urgency about rethinking how we're doing something as important as educating children? Everybody agrees this is critical. This is important. This is perhaps the most important thing we do. And yet we continue to fund a system that doesn't produce results.
That's a great question. And I always wonder, in all of these different reforms you hear about every several years, when are we going to have parents held a little more accountable?
Well, sure.
And they largely are off the hook. They want to point the finger at teachers and this and that. And I think we don't do enough to get some accountability out of moms and dads.
I agree about parents. But here's the thing. There's no question that mom and dad or the lack of a mom and dad have the greatest impact on a child's intellectual development. That's clear. But right below them, teachers. And you can't legislate a loving two-parent family.
No.
But you can, through legislation, provide opportunity so that the children and families that want to access better have access to better, and they're not discriminated against based on their household income and their address. And that's the system now at exorbitant prices. I mean, the CPS spends north of $15,000 per kid, which is about 30% more than they spend per kid in Wheaton.
Right.
And let me tell you, Wheaton is producing significantly better results than Chicago. Breaking news.
Sure. I don't argue those facts. I don't think there is a way to argue those facts. We've been involved in this discussion about changing the school aid formula. Senator Andy Menard has an idea. We had a bill that created equity grants to try and smooth out some of the disparity in funding without taking money away from some of the suburban areas mostly. That didn't quite meet the governor's approval, so now the governor has a new task force or commission at work. And I don't know where that's going to lead us. You know, I don't know changing the way you hand out the money necessarily is a way to do it. The question of
that's how you must do it.
The question of choices, though, I know Madigan's been supportive of the different initiatives on charter schools. That's probably the one that's gotten the most attention in Illinois, and the results there, I guess, probably mixed. There's been some good success. There's been some troubled. I don't recall a real concerted effort on vouchers. You may know better. You may know better than I.
Well, I mean, James Meeks 5 years ago.
Sure.
I mean, that was a fairly concerted effort to pass the Senate. It would have been the seed that could have been germinated in Chicago to prove up the concept and then expanded, assuming it worked like it has everywhere else, and like competition works everywhere else in our economy to produce better goods and services at lower costs, except for somehow K through 12 is exempt. And I think people have a right to ask, is K through 12 exempt because a lot of Republicans, but the entire Democrat Party power structure in this state is beholden to the teachers' unions as well as AFSCME and SEIU, where you get, tens of millions of dollars in funding every year. I mean, that's true.
And we're way behind the guys that are trying to take us all out, right? Even with tens of millions of dollars.
Recently, it's been equalized, but that hasn't been the case for most of the past 3 decades.
My guess is it's going to be made up. The equalization will be very swift this year, right?
But where are we 3 decades later? I mean, again, Madigan's probationary period has been pretty extensive. Mm-hmm. So after 3 decades, is it fair to say, well, let's assess what's happened during the course of this time period? And again, he doesn't bear sole responsibility, but he is near the top in terms of having to account for what's happened under his watch when everyone agrees, as we started the show, that he's the most powerful politician in the state.
Yeah, and but I'm not sure that's an accurate phrase because of the role he plays is only part of one branch of the government.
So he's just another state rep.
No, he's not just another state rep. He's the leader of one house in a bicameral legislature, right? In an executive branch. I think we both know, we've both been around the executive branch of government. They wield enormous power, have sometimes don't spend a lot of attention on what the law actually says, but what the rules they put together themselves that they create. So there's a lot of problems, Dan, and there's no argument with that. I'm just saying that I'm not sure I've seen solutions, or Mike Madigan has seen solutions that we believe would turn things around.